Nicole. It's good to be back. Happy New Year, everyone. Hope you all had a good holiday, and I wish everybody a happy and healthy 2022. Again, my thanks to Ashley, Nicole, and the whole team at My Health Angel. They do a great job. And I'm not saying this. It really is a pleasure to work with y'all. So I quite enjoy it, and I also
Same.
appreciate the inquisitive audience. So yeah. So let me share screen, and I have a good story for you, as Nicole said in her intro. And boom, there's the share screen. Now I'm going to put it on a full screen view for you. That way you can see less of me and more of the PowerPoint, which is always a good thing. Okay, so the book's called George Washington's Final Battle. It was my 45th, I think, book. It came out earlier this 2020. It came out in 2021. I'm real excited about the book. And let me tell you why I wrote it. And then I'll get into a fun story or two or three for you. So first off, when I started my career as a professor, I didn't want to be one of these historians that was narrowly focused on one person or one event or one battle or one decade, or I wanted to write about everything. So I literally made a list. I wanted to write about Lincoln and the Civil War. I wanted to write about the Revolution. I wanted to write about the Holocaust. I wanted to write about Truman, World War II, and I've covered all those, but I also wanted to write a book about George Washington. And I really thought about the appropriate topic for about 25 years. I couldn't think of the right topic. Why? You know, entire forests have been felled to fill the pages of books on George Washington. So I didn't want to just repeat that which has been, hashed over and over and over. I wanted to do something new. So I thought and I thought and I thought, and I finally had my eureka moment. So here's why I wrote the book. I love Washington, D.C. It's my favorite city in the United States. I love the tree-lined National Mall. I love the majestic memorials and monuments to our heroes and our fallen. I love the Smithsonian's. I mean, how do you not, right, everybody? World class, free. It's just extraordinary. I love the majestic government buildings. I really, really like the city. But here's what I found. No one knows the story of Washington. How did it become our capital? How was it built? Why did they pick the location? And it's a fascinating story. So I wanted to tell the story of the city. Relatedly, the person that picked the location, that advocated it, it was his idea. He hired the architects. He laid out the plans, oversaw the surveying. It was George Washington. George was, Alpha to Omega. George was in charge of everything. And he devoted the last 10 years of his life to building a capital city. It was, as the title of my book says, his final battle. And boy, was it a struggle. So he devoted 10 years to that. I found several papers, letters from other founding fathers that described Washington as having a fever about the capital city. In other words, he was obsessed with it. They would go in to meet with him about some topic, and all he wanted to do was talk about the capital city. So it was his laser focus, it was his passion, it was his vision, it was his obsession for the last decade of his life. Now, another reason to write the book is I've always thought that of all the founding fathers, that George Washington, despite being the most famous, he's also the hardest to know. Washington has come across the pages of history, 2+ centuries, as more myth than man, more flesh and more monument than flesh and blood. In other words, George is this monument who stands there staring at us without smiling. So he's almost presented unidimensionally, monolithically, very simplistically, when in fact I knew George was a complicated guy with many aspects to his personality, a fascinating individual. So what I did is I wanted to really kind of peel back the layers of the onion and flesh out the real George Washington. So that's what I wanted to do. For example, it's often said in the books that George Washington did not like politics and he wasn't a politician. We like to say that so he doesn't look like our politicians today, but make no mistake about it, everybody, he was a politician. George Washington could twist arms, lobby, swap votes, beg, cajole with the best of them. He was a politician. Let me give you a great example of what an impressive politician he was. When he was trying to get the capital city located. The legislation, it was a major piece of legislation in 1790 to locate the capital city. The first time he pushed it, it was called the Residence Act. There were a few of them, but one from 1790. When he first pushed the Residence Act, he was 4 votes shy in the Senate. Now, that's a lot. Why? Because the politics then were just like the politics today. They were gridlocked and dysfunctional, and no one would flip parties and flip votes. So 4 votes is a Herculean task. Secondly, there were only a few senators back then. So 4 votes would be like trying to flip 15 today. So Washington had his work cut out for him. So over lunch, he tells Hamilton and Madison, call for another vote. And they said, are you crazy? You know, you're 4 votes shy. Nobody's going to change over lunch. Then what's going to happen is you're going to look weak. You're going to look desperate because, you know, nobody's going to switch and you're calling for another vote and you're going to lose a second one. Washington said, call for another vote. What Washington wanted, Washington got. So they called for another vote. Over lunch, Washington went to visit 4 senators, not 5, 4. He knew the exact 4 to visit. He flipped over lunch all 4 senators. They all came in and voted for him, and he got his bill passed. That's some impressive politicking, everybody. Let me give you another example. Washington was not well educated, not well read like a Jefferson or a Franklin or a Madison or an Adams, but Washington was very creative and entrepreneurial. For example, if anybody been to Mount Vernon, his home? Mount Vernon is an experimental farm. He grew almost anything and everything that could grow in that climate at Mount Vernon. He was always experimenting with new agricultural products. He even had a greenhouse with tropical fruit and pineapples. Washington had an aquaculture. He had a fish farm, an aquaculture setup. When he had excess grains, he experimented with new ways of turning them into alcohol. When some grains weren't selling well, he found other ways of fermenting them. So Washington was experimental and creative. He was always thinking out of the box. A good example of that is during the Revolutionary War. Washington had no idea what he was doing. Imagine being, and he wasn't trained, he wasn't educated. Imagine being the general of a ragtag band of poorly trained blacksmiths and ill-equipped farmers against the world's greatest military. And George had no idea what he was doing, but he innovated, he was experimental, he tried new tactics. If they worked, he used them. If they didn't, he went to the next thing. One of the great leadership traits of Washington was he was not afraid to fail. He was not afraid to fail. And if he tried something that didn't work, he didn't latch onto it. He abandoned it and went to something else. He also surrounded himself with impressive people and listened to them because he knew that he didn't know much, which is another great leadership trait. Same thing in the inaugural presidency. The framers created a brand new type of government, heretofore unseen on this earth, a new type of democracy, far beyond what the Roman Senate practiced, far beyond even the ideas of the classic Greek philosophers. And we put this of, by, for the people, this republic in place. And they created a new office called president, which was a brand new form of office for a brand new type of government. George had no idea what he was doing. But what did he do? He was creative. He was innovative. He experimented. And you know what, everybody? He got it right. So that's why I wrote the book. I wanted to tell the story of the Capitol, wanted to reveal Washington's character and talk about the last 10 years of his life and this epic struggle to create our wonderful national capital. So that's, of course, George there on the right. I always love that portrait. And there's a beautiful image from the Capitol looking down at the statue of Grant, who's protecting the Capitol. And there we see the castle on the left from the Smithsonian. We see the National Mall, the 555-foot tall Washington Monument, and behind it, my favorite, the Lincoln Memorial. So whenever you talk about George Washington, Armand, what does everybody say? Frida, everybody says what? Did he have wooden teeth? Right? Or they say, did he cut down the cherry tree? That's what everybody says. The answer to both questions No. So let's start with the cherry tree. Here's the story that we're all taught in kindergarten. That's Washington's father, Augustine, who dies when George is a young boy, around the age that he's depicted in this photo, in this painting. So Augustine buys George an axe, and Augustine has a fruit farm. And one day he goes out, and guess what? One of his trees is hacked. So Augustine says to George, quote unquote, George, who killed my cherry tree? And George says, what? I cannot tell a lie. I did. It was me, right? Now, Augustine then says, well, that's okay, because by telling me the truth, you've repaid me 1,000-fold over what the fruit from that tree would have paid me. Now, that story never happened. In fact, if I bought my son an axe and he cut down a tree, I wouldn't worry about him. But if he told me, Father, I cannot tell a lie, then I'd worry about him. It'd make him a precocious little bugger, wouldn't it, everybody? So here's what happened. George died on December 14th, 1799. And there was a preacher turned bookseller named Parson Mason Locke Weems, W-E-E-M-S, who wanted to make money off of George's passing. So he hired an historian to write a book. The problem is the book's this thick, there's no photos, half the country's illiterate, people are still broke from the war. And back then we didn't have Amazon.com, right? So he had to load up the books in a wagon and ride up and down the East Coast in the spring and fall when the weather was okay, but nobody bought the book. He lost everything. So he goes back to Philadelphia and decides he's going to write the book himself. And he makes it all up. And it's a heck of a book, and it sells like hotcakes. And after several editions, around the 5th edition of the book, a few years later, he comes up with the idea of the cherry tree story, and he adds it to the book. Why? Parson Weems liked Aesop's fables, the little mouse that pulled the thorn out of the lion's paw and stuff like that. He wanted these moral vignettes, these bedtime stories. So what's a better bedtime story in the young country than when George Washington was your age, he couldn't tell a lie. So that's where the story comes from. Down at the bottom, the teeth. Did George have wooden teeth? No. We know exactly what kind of teeth he had. They were made of a type of steel and gold, and they had springs in them, an iron rather, and gold and springs in them. They had horse's teeth and hippopotamus ivory in them. Yikes, that's horrendous. Now, we know exactly what are in the teeth because you're looking at a set of them. A couple of pairs of George's dentures survived. Ditto, his letters to his London merchant, Robert Carey, also survived. And the letters to his dentist, Dr. John Greenwood, also survived. So we know exactly what kind of teeth he had. Where did the wooden come from? George once wrote a letter to Dr. Greenwood, his dentist, saying, Washington drank 3 glasses of port or dark wine with every meal, and his teeth had turned into like a wood color. He said, my teeth look like wood. How do I get these stains off of them? So Greenwood told him how to do it, and then saved that letter. Everybody saw the letter, so they thought Washington had wooden teeth. Okay? All right, so here's our story. The Revolutionary War was from 1775 until 1783. So this is a long war, 8 years, devastating war. The British had blockaded much of the eastern seaboard. Therefore, entire towns and entire economies went belly up. So the period after the Revolutionary War, from 1783 until 1787, those 4 years from the end of the war until the Constitutional Convention, those 4 years are called by historians the critical period. Why? Because the country was going to collapse. If you replay it several times, the United States never should have made it. We were in trouble. George Washington didn't think the United States was going to make it. So Washington identifies a couple of problems, and he realizes he wants to retire. He missed his beloved Mount Vernon. He said he had no other desire than to return to his beloved vine and fig, a biblical reference. He wanted to go home. But Washington realized his work was still in front of him, and he was needed because the country wasn't going to make it. So Washington identifies 4 problems, which I put on the screen here for you. Number 1, the government's not going to make it. Why? Because the country's not going to make it. We were in massive debt. Each state had its own currency. The currency wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. We didn't have banks. We didn't have trade. You know, you have to be careful what you wish for. We wanted to get rid of the British, and it worked. But when the British left, they took all the surgeons and architects and doctors and bankers with them. Now we didn't have anyone to build the ports, to build the ships, to protect our ships. American shipping was sacked by pirates after the British stopped protecting our ships because we were no longer a colony. So Washington said the government's not going to endure. We need to do something to, give the people faith in their government and give this government some legitimacy. Problem number 2 on the screen, the people lacked a national character. If you took a time machine and you went back and you met Thomas Jefferson in 1776, and if you asked Thomas Jefferson about his country or his nation, you know what he would answer? Virginia. So nobody saw the United States. We didn't have a nation. There was no national pride, no American identity, no sense of a national character. A lot of people saw themselves still as British subjects or as English. Many were still loyal to England. So we needed to create some national identity. For instance, if you go back and you look at letters written around this time, the United States, here's how they wrote it: plural, these, plural, United States. In other words, the states, plural, not singular, the United States. They also often wrote the word united with a small letter U. These, plural, small letter U, United States, a noun with a capital S. We were the states. After Washington, we start to write the, singular, capital letter U, noun, United States. Number 3, we had no credibility in the eyes of Europe. Europe saw us as what we were, a cultural backwater and an upstart. A land of a continent of monarchs does not take too kindly to a government that overthrows a monarch, right? And defies the God-given birthright of the divine right of kings. So how do we conduct treaties, trade, and alliances with Europe if we don't have any credibility? So Washington knew we had to deal with that. And lastly, we saw the creation of factions and political parties. You had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were people like Washington, Adams, Hamilton, John Jay, Ben Franklin, largely from the North, largely urban, who wanted a stronger government. They would be Democrats today. Then you had the Anti-Federalists: Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine. They were largely Southern, largely slave owners. They wanted virtually no government, a weak government. They would be Republicans today. So we had this split, and anything the Federalists tried to do, the Anti-Federalists killed. When one side said yes, the other side said no. And add to that sectionalism. We saw the North and the South already starting to bicker. So Washington realizes these 4 problems are going to tear this country apart. There's no way we're going to endure. So he says, we need a solution. He had a vision for America. And what was it? To build a great capital city. Washington wanted to build the greatest capital in the world. He wanted it to be larger than London and Paris. I mean, that's amazing. He wanted it to be like the ancient city of Rome. He wanted to channel ancient Athens in a spirit of democracy. Washington had a grand vision. If we build a great capital, here's what he said: it'll bring the 2 factions together. It'll give the government credibility. It'll be bigger than the capitals in Europe, so we'll have credibility in the eyes of Europe. It'll imbue the people with a sense of an American and national pride. If we locate it halfway between the North and South, both sides will be okay. And it'll be a major construction boom. We'll need banks and currency. And so one size fits all, one-stop shopping. That's Washington. He said, with our fate, will the destiny of unborn millions be involved? If we do this, America has a chance. If we don't, we're done. So The problem for Washington was insurrection. On the picture here and then the image on the left, this is Washington's final headquarters at Newburgh in New York. Anybody been up there? Hudson River, everybody? Not far from FDR's Hyde Park, not far from West Point. Lovely part of the country, right, everybody? So along the Hudson. That was Washington's longest and last headquarters. When he was there was a new threat, not the threat from the British, the threat of boredom. Another threat, cold weather. The men had not been paid. They'd been fighting for years. They're bored. The war's all but over. We're just waiting for the British to capitulate. And bitter cold winter sets in. And there was a mutiny, an uprising. It happened on March 15th, 1783, where inside Washington's own command, they tried to overthrow him and march on Congress. Oh my gosh. At the very final moment of the war, we forgot all the lessons and almost undermined everything we fought for. Then a few months later, on June 20th, 1783, with the Congress and our politicians in the Capitol, which at the time was a temporary building, Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Tomorrow is the anniversary of January 6th. The same thing happened on June 20th, 1783. A bunch of folks claiming to be patriots with flagpoles and everything else busted out the windows, attacked the building, tried to seize Congress, capture or kill people. And it scared the hell out of Washington and everybody. They knew we needed a capital, and they knew we needed a great and powerful one, and they knew we needed a government. This is where it all starts. Washington and others also knew that the capital could never be under a city or under a state, because it couldn't be beholden to the city where it was located or beholden to any one state. Therefore, they wanted to create a federal district. And they wanted to name the district in honor of Christopher Columbus. They picked the feminine, and today we have the District of Columbia. So that's where it came from. So we had a civic vacuum. When the British left, there went the ability to build ships, build ports, protect the ships. All the architects left, all the educated left, and we were left with mounting debts, worthless currency, unpaid vets, and a war-torn landscape. I found several newspapers that said, "What happens next?" Other ones said, "Have we really fought for this?" The country was about to fail until Washington enters with his idea of a capital. Now, here's the problem. We went for 25 years, a quarter century, without a permanent capital, without a permanent seat of government, from 1775 until 1800. It's no way to start a new nation if you don't even have a capital. That's like should be step number one. So we didn't have a capital. The problem was everybody wanted their own city to be the capital. Look at the screen. Here's a list of some of the cities under consideration to be the capital. Yes, your eyes are not deceiving you. Under New York, Brooklyn was being considered as the capital. Yep, must have been the pizza, right, everybody? So Brooklyn. Georgetown under Maryland, Georgetown used to be part of Maryland until it was given to DC, the federal district. So the problem was everybody wanted their city to be the capital, which means no one would accept any other site to be the capital. They wanted their city because of pride. Everybody loves their city. Secondly, economics. Could you imagine if your city becomes the capital, the construction boom that would follow? The entire government, the entire Congress, the entire military would move to your city. Whatever land you owed would quadruple in value. So everybody wanted the economics to come to their city. Therefore, for example, in Connecticut, Hartford and New Haven were both under consideration, but Hartford spent all of its time undermining New Haven. New Haven spent all of its time bad-mouthing Hartford because they both wanted the capital. The only time they got together was to make sure it would be in Connecticut and not in Maryland. Meanwhile, both Annapolis and Baltimore in Maryland wanted to be the capital. So you guessed it, Annapolis spent all of its time undermining Baltimore. Baltimore devoted its energies to bad-mouthing Annapolis. The only time they got together was to prevent the capital from going to Connecticut because they both wanted it to be in Maryland. So it was that kind of dysfunction. Ultimately, George Washington says, okay, you know what? None of the above. We're going to build a brand new capital out of the forests and fields and bogs and swamps. Foggy Bottom, Washington, D.C. was a swamp. We're going to build the capital out of the wetlands and bogs and forests, a brand new city. We're going to hack it out of the woods. Ben Franklin even joked, because nobody could agree on the capital and the Congress was so unpopular. He said we should have many capitals and we'll rotate them. He said we could build a Trojan horse, hide Congress in it, and wheel it into the cities each night, let them sneak out and do business, and then get back in and run before anybody figured them out. So that's all the cities under consideration. Now, during the Constitutional Convention, everybody, as you all know, Berna and Bill know, right? The Strums know, Susie Glatt knows, right? Elaine Bergman knows that there were some contentious debates during the Constitutional Convention. Slavery, the Three-Fifths Clause, the Electoral College, but the most heated debate of the entire Constitutional Convention was, where do we put the capital? I call this the other founding debate. George Washington said the debate over the capital was so toxic that if they tried to locate the capital that summer in Philadelphia during the convention, he said nobody would have signed the Constitution. For example, Southerners were threatening to leave the Union if they didn't get the capital in the South. Virginians said, if it's not in Virginia, we won't sign the Constitution, we'll leave the Union. That's how dicey it was. So what did the founders do? Nothing. They dealt with everything else but the capital city. They didn't discuss it. They didn't pick the capital city. All the debates, should we have one? Where should it be? How big should it be? What's the design? Who should pay for it? How do we build it? Nobody answered any of these. Why? They knew it would end the Constitution. The only thing they agreed on in the Constitutional Convention was George Washington wanted the capital to be bigger than Paris, London, or ancient Rome or ancient Athens. So they agreed it would be 10 miles square. That's 100 miles. It would be massive. This is audacious, everybody. We can't even, everybody's broke. We don't even have architects or builders, and we're going to build the biggest capital. So that's how toxic the debate was. Now, 1787 is the Constitutional Convention. We have to swear George Washington in and have a government. They didn't know where to swear him in because we had no permanent seat for government. So 2 years later, in 1789, they decided George Washington would be sworn in and we'd finally have a United States. Where? They couldn't figure it out. We only had 3 cities big enough to host the capital: Philadelphia, the largest city, Boston, and New York. No one could agree, so they finally went with New York. Why? Because Hamilton wanted New York, and everything Hamilton wanted, Washington agreed with, because Hamilton was more like Washington's son than his aide. So they went to New York City. On the left there, the picture, you all recognize that? Everybody recognize that? So that's Federal Hall, right, everybody? Right on Wall Street. There used to be a wall there, right next to the stock exchange. That was the first Capitol. The statue of George Washington out front, that's where he was sworn in 1789. If you're looking at that building, just to the left is Trinity Church, where a lot of the founders are buried. Right down the street is Fraunces Tavern, which is where they all went to eat and drink. Now, what would be the White House, the president's house? You're looking at it on the right. That's the Osgood Cherry Street house. That's where George governed from. That was his house. The problem was no one liked New York City. I put some quotes there on the screen. Jefferson and Southerners complained about the cold weather. Jefferson wrote, "Spring and fall they never have, as far as I can learn. They have 10 months of winter, 2 of summer. That's why me and other people moved to South Florida." Fisher Ames of Massachusetts, he said, "New York City's overrun by hogs, dogs, and garbage." So no one liked it, so they were going to leave New York City. Where would the new capital be? No one knew. Now, the politics were so contentious and partisan, just like today, so hyper-partisan, that they couldn't figure out if we should have a bank. We had no currency. We couldn't figure out where to put the Capitol. We didn't know how to build it. We couldn't figure out how to repay our veterans. We couldn't figure out how to repay Europe, who lent us money during the war. This is how toxic it was. So how did we solve all the problems? That was done on June 20th, 1790, in one night over dinner. I call it the second most famous dinner in history. About 25 years ago, I was giving a speech on this famous dinner party that solved all the founding problems. And I called it the most famous dinner in history. And a lady in the front of the audience stood up and started screaming at me. And I said, ma'am, calm down. What's the problem? She said, that is not the most famous dinner in history. I said, okay, what is? She said, the Last Supper. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. So ever since then, I call it the second most famous dinner in history. So here's what it is. We have two parties, the Federalists led by Hamilton and the Anti-Federalists led by Jefferson. The problem for Jefferson was Washington saw Hamilton more as a son. Whatever Hamilton wanted, he got. So Jefferson's losing every debate to Hamilton. One day, the night before this party, so June 19th, 1790, Jefferson's standing outside of George's rented house, the Osgood Cherry Street house I just showed you. And he hears Hamilton and Washington in there screaming at one another. It's volcanic. Hamilton comes walking out looking disheveled and depressed. Jefferson realizes there's now a rift between the father and the son, Washington and Hamilton. Therefore, Jefferson says, I need to strike now. If I get Hamilton to come to my house tomorrow night, June 20th, 1790, his rented home on 57 Maiden Lane, he says, I can get Hamilton to agree to everything I want, and Washington won't have his back. Hamilton was in Washington's pocket, or Washington was in Hamilton's pocket. So without Washington right now, I can get whatever I wanted. So Jefferson sees a depressed Hamilton and disheveled and says, come to my house tomorrow night. Hamilton says, okay. Jefferson invites his friend Madison to join him. You can see from the picture there. It's Jefferson sitting down with Madison beside him, talking to Hamilton. Now, Jefferson and Madison say, we're smart, so we're going to dupe Hamilton and get everything we want. Here's what they didn't realize. Hamilton's smart, but he's also street smart. The short story, everybody. Here's the short story, Elaine. Hamilton gets everything he wants. He dupes Jefferson. He plays Jefferson and Madison like fools. So here we go. So what do we do about the debt? So Hamilton wanted to pay back the debt. Hamilton knew we needed a bank, we needed currency, we needed public credit, debt, and everything else to pay back the debt. Jefferson, Madison in the South refused to pay taxes. They said, if we have to pay taxes, we'll leave the Union. Jefferson, Madison and the Southerners said, we refuse to pay back our debts. They wouldn't pay back the debt for the veterans. They wouldn't pay back our European allies. They wouldn't enter into any treaties with Europe. They said we threatened to leave the Union. So Jefferson and Madison tell Hamilton, the South and Virginia will not pay taxes and will not pay its debt. To their amazement, Hamilton said, okay. Now, if the South doesn't pay taxes or the debt, and the North can't pay, why can't the North pay? Because Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania funded the war. The North is too poor to pay. The South refused to pay. That means we're not going to have much of a government because we have no revenue. And that's exactly what Jefferson and Madison wanted. Because if you don't have much of a government, who's most powerful? Slave owners. Okay. So to their amazement, when they say we're not paying taxes, we're not paying the debt, we refuse to cooperate, otherwise we leave the Union. Hamilton says, okay. But here's what Hamilton knew that they didn't know. If the South won't pay the debt and the North can't pay the debt, the only way to move forward is what's called debt assumption. The federal government assumes states' debts. And who assumes them? The treasurer. Who was our treasurer? Hamilton. Hamilton needed a bank, currency, and everything to do all this. By Jefferson and Madison refusing to participate, Hamilton has the excuse to build the bank, build one in New York, establish our currency, set up a strong government, and assumed states' debts, it made Hamilton the most powerful person in the country. Now, where should the capital be? Jefferson and Madison said, if it's not in the South, we Southerners are going to leave the nation. In fact, Jefferson and Madison said, if it's not in Virginia, Virginia leaves. So they wouldn't, they wouldn't negotiate or cooperate, much like prominent Southern politicians today. And in fact, it led John Adams to joke that only in Virginia are all geese swans. And I'm allowed to make fun of Virginia. I went to college there, used to live there. Love the state. But so Jefferson and Madison said, if it's not in Virginia, we leave. To their amazement, what did Hamilton say? Okay. He agreed. They couldn't believe it. But what they didn't know was Hamilton had insider information. Washington already told Hamilton, I'm putting the capital in Virginia near my home next to the Potomac. So Hamilton gave away that which was already decided, and he used that to leverage other votes to his favor. Let me do one more for the sake of time. What should the capital look like? Most Northerners in Washington and Hamilton wanted a great city, Rome, Athens, right? If you have a great capital, it gives the country power, credibility, strengthens the government. Jefferson and Madison wanted a simple, small federal village. Get this, a few one-story brick buildings separated by fields and forests. So Jefferson and Madison say, if we don't get what we want, a couple little single-story brick buildings, then we leave the Union. Once again, the South won't cooperate, won't negotiate, won't help the nation. To their amazement, what did Hamilton say, everybody? Susie, you know the answer. Elaine knows the answer. Hamilton said, okay. Now, Jefferson says, so here's what we'll do. We'll create a design contest because they have no architects, no builders. They all left and went back to England. He said, we'll create a design contest, let the people submit designs. Then he said, we'll put a committee together to pick the winning design for the Capitol. And since I'm such a good guy, said Jefferson, I'll chair the committee. Jefferson anonymously submits his own design for a few little one-story brick buildings separated by fields and forests. Then he picks his winning design. He shows it to Hamilton and says, here it is. To his amazement, Hamilton said, okay. So they went to see Washington. Washington blew a gasket. Absolutely not. He said, we're going to do this. Here's my plan. We're going to build Rome, ancient Athens, 100 miles. It's going to be the greatest city ever built. So Hamilton plays Jefferson as a fool. He and Washington get everything they want. Now, who's going to build the Capitol? We don't have architects. Washington picked this guy, Pierre Charles L'Enfant. Anybody been to Washington, D.C.? Isn't half the city named for L'Enfant? It's because he's the one that designed it. L'Enfant was a brilliant choice by Washington. Why? L'Enfant was classically educated in Paris. He was an architect and an engineer, and a gifted one. 2, he was a great intellectual, very impressive man. 3, he fought in the Revolutionary War. And unlike Jefferson and Madison, L'Enfant actually joined the military and fought with great valor and heroism. So Washington and Hamilton trusted him. Next, he was a Mason. Wasn't Washington and most of the founders Masons, everybody? And the Masons were master builders. Therefore, they could pick their friends to help build the city. And the main reason why Washington picked L'Enfant was because L'Enfant was a megalomaniac. He was such an egomaniac. He said, I will do this only if I can build the greatest city in history. That's what Washington wanted. So here's L'Enfant's design. So look familiar, anyone? It's Washington, D.C. today. Look, see the cursor here in the middle of the screen? That's the National Mall. Here's the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, Jefferson Memorial, the White House, Grant, the Capitol, Supreme Court, Library of Congress, National Mall. L'Enfant tells Washington, I want to build the greatest city ever. Washington said, oh yeah, I like that. L'Enfant said, we're going to have wide boulevards like ancient Rome or Paris. Washington said, oh, I like that. L'Enfant said, where those boulevards intersect, and you can see from the map, There's big public squares. We're going to fill them with memorials and monuments and statues. Washington said, I like that. L'Enfant said, I'm even going to build a national mall for people to walk around and bring the country together. Washington liked that. He said, we're going to fill it with cultural institutions and a national university to attract the best and brightest. That's what George wanted. Don't we have the Smithsonian today, everybody? And we have American University, a national university, which I've helped to pay for because my son goes there. You should see the tuition. So L'Enfant proceeds to build a recreation of Rome and Paris, and Washington loved it. And that's the National Mall and our national capital today. Now, we need a presidential home. Not just any home will do. Jefferson enters the argument again and says to Washington, here, I have a design for a little one-story cottage. Washington says, no, I want a palace. So he finds an architect, another immigrant like Hamilton and like L'Enfant, named James Hoban. He's from Ireland. And if anybody's been to Charleston, South Carolina, you probably love the city. It's a great city, beautiful architecture. Hoban designed a lot of the public buildings there. Washington fell in love with the architecture, so he hired Hoban. And Hoban says, you know, I don't want to build a building. I want to build a presidential palace. Washington said, oh, I love that. Hoban said, it'll be the biggest home ever. Washington said, oh, I love that. Hoban said, I'm going to put big columns in front of it like ancient Greece or ancient Rome. Washington said, yeah, give me a bunch of those. Hoban said, all the rage in Europe now are oval rooms. Washington said, put some of those in there. And he did. Here's the original design by James Hoban. On the left, looks like the White House today. On the right, looks like the White House today. The only difference is it doesn't have that roof on the White House today because they ran out of money. And Hoban's design was a lot bigger. Because they ran out of money, they had to make it a little smaller. But the proof is in the pudding, everybody. George Washington's brilliant vision worked. Washington came up with the idea of a capital city. He's the one who wanted the giant city. He wanted the design. He hired the architects. He oversaw the building. He picked the location. He surveyed the grounds. He's the one who sold plots of land, bought and sold property, raised the money. Everything about the capital city, A through Z, was Washington's vision and Washington's alone. Had Adams, had anyone else tried to do this, it never would have worked because it was so preposterous and audacious. Only Washington alone was able to get it done. And the name they decided for the capital city was Washingtonopolis. Can anybody join me in saying yikes? Washingtonopolis. Thank goodness they shortened that to just Washington. They wanted the federal district named for Columbus, so it was the District of Columbia. And that is probably Washington's ultimate legacy because it allowed this fledgling nation to endure. And all the problems Washington identified proved to be true, and his solution to build this greatest city ever to solve all the problems worked. And Washington, unfortunately, passed away in 1799, 1 year before the city opened up. You know, when you travel up and down the East Coast, whenever you go to an old colonial village or town, what do they say? George Washington slept here, right, everybody? The short answer, probably not. The one place Washington never slept was the White House. It opened on November 1st, 1800, 1 year after his passing. Oh, that's a shameless plug. Let me go back and say this. John Adams played almost no role in it, yet he was the first resident of the White House, moved in November 1, 1800. He was the first resident of the capital city when it opened up. Adams realized that first night alone in the building that Washington's vision was brilliant. It would save this nation. Adams agreed with Washington and vowed to fight for Washington's great city and this nation. And that first night, he wrote a poem and a prayer. And today, it's in the main fireplace. There's 3 dozen, but the main fireplace in the White House, put there by FDR shortly before his death in April of 1945. What did Adams's poem and prayer say? It was an ode and honor to Washington and this great home and city that Washington created. It said, I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings upon this house and all who shall hereafter reside in it. May none but wise and honorable men ever rule under this roof. And that is the story of George Washington and the capital city. There's the book. If you use that code TGUE, my publisher, Georgetown University, said that they'll give people a 30% discount and waive the shipping. So since you're all friends, I'll pass it along. And that, everybody, is the story. Thank you.
That's amazing. I see that Esther had a question. What was Washington's personality like as seen by others?
Washington was seen as having a great honor, he had integrity. He was actually a somewhat quiet individual. He didn't like to speak in public. He was a lot like me in that he didn't like public speaking and he was a bit shy. Washington was a physically very big man, 6'2", broad-shouldered, size 13 shoes, powerfully built shoulders, large hands. He was massive for the day and age. He'd be big for today. So Washington impressed people with his size and his honor. He was also suicidally brave on the battlefield. We have countless reliable stories of Washington killing people in battle, leading from the front. He was a very, very brave warrior on the battlefield. He also had a volcanic temper and could be a bit insecure because unlike the other founders, he wasn't traveled, well-read, or well-educated. So Washington didn't say a lot. Several scholars, and I agree with them, say that Washington's notorious discipline and resolve are a byproduct of his lifelong struggle to suppress his temper. He didn't want to lose his temper in public. So you can see he was a complicated man, an interesting man. We can't appreciate his charisma because he lived in the pre-video, pre-audio era. But if you think of someone, I don't know, a Reagan and Obama, or whatever, someone who's very, very charismatic today, multiply that by several points, and then you're getting into Washington territory. So good question.
Yeah, and she actually also asked would you say that Washington was like Lyndon Johnson and knowledge of others' faults in order to get his way politically?
Washington could twist arms and get votes easily. So could LBJ. There's a difference in how they did it. LBJ would bully people into voting with him. He would shame them into it. He would get emotional and appeal to that, or he was just manipulative. Washington used his stature and gravitas. Washington's the biggest man they saw. He looked good in the uniform. He looked like the man on horseback. His sword, he was a meticulous dresser. Washington would stand on the raised dais or dais when he talked to people. He would nod. He worked on a fancy curtsy, which was like something out of a movie from, a monarch in the medieval times. So Washington was theatrical, dramatic. He got people to vote his way because he knew they were in awe of him, and he used his political capital wisely. So Washington and LBJ could wrangle votes. Someone said, why was L'Enfant fired? L'Enfant was perfect for the job because he was brilliant and he shared Washington's vision, but L'Enfant was a diva. He was extremely difficult. No one could work with him. He refused to work with anybody but Washington. Washington hired the 3 commissioners in charge of the federal district, but L'Enfant wouldn't talk to him. They gave him orders and he refused to talk to them. Jefferson, the Secretary of State, gave L'Enfant orders. He refused to talk to him. The Congress wanted L'Enfant to come and testify about the city. He didn't show up. So the only one he would talk to was Washington. So Washington gave him a number of chances. Finally, Washington had no choice but to fire L'Enfant. However, L'Enfant had already submitted his brilliant design. Washington kept the design. So another good question.
Okay, and let's see, I see, well, Armand's on the phone, but I know he has his hand up, so we'll just wait for him. Anybody else have any questions? Any comments, any questions? Everybody's good. Okay, here we go. The play Hamilton wasn't too far off regarding the story of how Washington was chosen, like the real version.
Yes, good observation. I don't know Lin-Manuel Miranda, but I do know Ron Chernow, whose book was the basis for the musical. And Cherno told me that Miranda followed the book throughout and asked Cherno to look at each scene and offer insights to make sure they depicted Washington accurately. So despite the colorblind casting, I think the overall depiction of Washington is spot on. Some of the lines from the musical are from exact quotes, the chronology of events, the dates for the Battle of Yorktown, et cetera. It's all spot on. So yes, good point, good observation. The way they depict Washington and the way the reverence for him, but yet he didn't say a lot. He would show up and that was, people cowered. When Jefferson, for example, opposed Washington, but he was always afraid of Washington. He was intimidated by Washington. So he never spoke his mind around Washington. He would zip it when Washington was around, as did a lot of the founders, because Washington had such gravitas and again, esteem, and he was just such a powerful man. So yeah, I love the musical's depiction of Washington. Love it.
Right. And Armand, go ahead.
Yes. Do you know if Martha was still alive when all of this was going on and whether she saw the White House?
Good question, Armand, and thank you. You always come to these lectures. I appreciate your interest. The answer is yes, yes, and yes. So George died in mid-December of 1799, but Martha would live until May of 1802. The White House, the capital city opened up November 1, 1800. So Martha was there throughout the 10 years that George obsessed about the capital city. She was there when he rode around the entirety of what is today Washington, D.C. She was there when he hired L'Enfant and Hoban. She was there when he had the commissioners come to his house and give him updates on the building. She was sitting there listening to them. Did she play any role? No, but she was a fly on the wall throughout the process. After George died, she went to see it. Washington had bought property there and was starting to build a house in the city where he was going to use as a second home. Tragically, when the British burned Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812, they burned it on August 24th, 1814. The home that Washington had bought and started building was burned. So we don't have that in the city today. That would be a great museum. So yeah, Martha knew everything that was going on, although she didn't really play a role. Good question, Armand.
Okay, and Pat, I see your hand up. Pat Potter, go ahead.
Dr. Watson, in terms of the first bank and the currency, who designed the American currency?
Okay, short answer is we don't know. Long answer, committee, and Hamilton played a role. Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton plays a lead role in being the architect of the US Bank, the Bank of America, and the Bank of New York. Hamilton also plays a role in the committee that designs the currency. So Hamilton's fingerprints are on everything. The papers and letters around the currency itself have been lost to history, but we have enough information that we can piece it together and figure all that stuff out. The problem, of course, was each state had its own currency at the time, and none of it was worth anything. It was utterly worthless. So Hamilton creates this notion of credit. Hamilton backs it up with land, with gold. Hamilton pays back veterans in land because they didn't have the money, but by farming the land and developing the land, that would create revenue and help the country to grow and put us back on our feet. Hamilton also built ports and things, bridges, infrastructure, what we would call it today. Back then they called it public improvements, because he knew that what our Congress today doesn't know. Hamilton knew that these infrastructure projects were good for the country. They were investments and would help make money. He also passed like levies and excise taxes on imports to try to help fund the government and pay back the debt. So Hamilton was very innovative and creative, and his fingerprints are all over the bank, the currency, everything. Yeah, another good question. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.
And Jewel had asked, how did the government acquire the land for the District of Columbia?
Well, a couple of ways. DC was a village, but only a handful of people. It was literally forests and fields and bogs. So it was unbelievably humid in the summers. It was covered in mosquitoes and bugs because of the bogs. The Potomac often flooded. So it was not an attractive location. So what Washington did was he sold plots of land. He announced that they're going to put the city as shape of a diamond, a Masonic image, where it is today and along the Potomac on land ceded from Maryland and Virginia. So the first way they did it was they got Maryland and Virginia to give up some of their land. Now, Maryland wanted the capital and Virginia wanted the capital, but they knew if they worked together and they each gave land on either side of the river, that they had a better chance, and that's what ended up working. So Maryland and Virginia gave the land for free. They also gave money to help build the capital city because they knew they'd benefit. Washington sold plots of land in the capital, and people bought those because they knew that once the capital opened, they'd be worth a lot more money. They could resell them. So that's how they acquired it. The few people that lived in the city either gave up their property right away and sold it to make money, or they donated the property for a deed where they could have some of the land back after the city was opened up. There was only one person, an old cantankerous fella who wouldn't cooperate. And he had a house right smack in the middle of the mall, and he wouldn't give it up. There's always that one guy, right? Remember the movie Up? That was like the old guy that floated away in a balloon. So he wouldn't do it. Washington sent him several letters asking him to please cooperate on behalf of the nation. Washington dispatched envoys. When the guy didn't do it, Washington walked down and told him, get out of the house and I'm tearing it down. And the man did, and they tore it down. So, yeah.
And Susie asked, whose idea was the cherry blossoms?
Cherry blossoms come from Japan, goes all the way back to President Taft at the early 1900s, his wife, Helen Herron Taft. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, some first ladies thought it would beautify the city, and Japan donated those as a gesture to create US-Japanese relations. The first batch of trees that they donated got a disease and all died. So then Japan donated a second batch, which were planted along the National Mall. And today, as you know, when the blossoms and the cherry blossoms bloom, Washington, D.C. is nothing shy of stunning. Yes, so it dates to the late 1800s and early 1900s, thanks to some early first ladies who wanted to beautify the city.
Okay, and then Esther asked, did Washington's membership as a Mason play any role in his decisions as president? There's a Masonic symbol on our currency, the seeing eye. What is that about?
Yeah, yes, and yes, and yes, and yes. Washington was a Mason. He was an ardent Mason. So was Ben Franklin. So was Hamilton. So was Lafayette. A lot of them were. L'Enfant was. Hoban was. They got Masons who were stone masons and master builders and carpenters and bricklayers to all come in and help. So yeah, that plays a role. And when Washington opened the Capitol, when Washington did the laying of the cornerstone at the Capitol building, he did it in a Masonic ceremony with the Masonic image carved on it. When they laid the cornerstone for the White House, another Masonic ceremony. And the city is designed in Masonic form. So everything about it. As president, Washington relied on fellow Masons for input and advice. Don't think of it as a secret society with some secret handshake and some cabal to take over the world. It was well-placed professionals who all worked together, cooperated, donated money and their energies and talents. So Washington used it throughout his presidency. No question.